Hello, survivalists. This is the Crux True Survival Story podcast. I'm your host, Casey McIntosh, joined by Julie Henningsen. Julie is going to be leading the story for us today. Hello, Julie.
Hi, Casey. Picture this. It's 1914. We're going back in history a little bit, and the most famous man in America is lost in the Amazon rainforest, burning with fever and staring death in the face. This is a man who's already survived assassination attempts, boxing matches in the White House, charging up the San Juan Hill, but this time, well, he might not make it out alive.
Oh, no. It's like he's a cat. He's got 9 lives.
And he's about on his 9th.
This has got to be Roosevelt.
Yes, good call. Theodore Roosevelt is our character today.
Good old Teddy.
Teddy. This isn't just another story about a president. This is a tale of what happens when you take one of history's most larger-than-life figures and drop him into one of the most dangerous river expeditions ever attempted.
It's just crazy to think about that. Unfortunately, this was before smartphones, and so the whole world had no idea what was happening, but they would all be just waiting with bated breath.
They had no idea what was happening, and they didn't believe it when they heard it after the fact because it was so unbelievable. They eventually did, but yes, there was no camera evidence or GPS tracking proof that Roosevelt could provide.
He was like, "No, seriously, guys, I went through hell." They're like, "Whatever, you're so full of it."
This journey was so intense. It would leave men dead, it would turn father against son, and it forced heroes to contemplate murder out of mercy.
Ooh, crazy.
So we're heading down the River of Doubt, Casey, a remote, unmapped tributary of the Amazon that nearly claimed the life of President Theodore Roosevelt.
Gosh, that does not sound like a trip that you want to sign up for. And also, there's no bug spray at this point. I just want to remind you about that.
No bug spray, which actually turned into a significant problem, as you can imagine.
Ugh.
If you think about all of the critters and animals and wildlife to worry about in the Amazon jungle, the bugs are probably one of the biggest problems. At least they were for this expedition.
Yeah, another thing is the lack of sunscreen at that time.
Fortunately, plenty of shade overhead. So before we dive into this wild adventure, I just want to give you some context about who Theodore Roosevelt was at this point in his life. So he wasn't just any ex-president kind of going on a casual jungle trek. Roosevelt was arguably one of the most famous men in the world. During his presidency, which was from 1901 to 1909, he had built a reputation as this kind of larger than life character who at one point literally got shot during a speech and kept talking for another 84 minutes before stopping to seek medical attention.
That is ridiculous. Did that actually happen for real?
Yes, this remarkable incident occurred on October 14th, 1912. This was when Theodore Roosevelt was in the middle of a presidential campaign, trying to go for a third term as the Progressive Party candidate. And he was greeting supporters outside of a hotel in Milwaukee when, in the middle of his speech, he was shot in the chest by a deranged saloon keeper that showed up on the scene. Remarkably, the bullet was slowed by both Roosevelt's steel eyeglass case that was in his pocket and a thick, folded in half, 50-page speech manuscript that he had in the breast pocket of his jacket.
Oh my gosh. I can't believe he was shot in the chest.
In the chest.
I was like, it's fine.
And despite the eyeglasses case, the 50-page manuscript, the bullet still lodged in his chest wall. And he insisted on continuing his speech, saying, "I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." That's how he identified himself. And the Bull Moose Party was his political party, and that was his spirit animal, I guess. Roosevelt kept speaking for 84 minutes while blood was seeping through his shirt. And you could see the blood starting to show up as he's talking and droning on. That's a long time.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
You know, actually, who I could picture doing this would be Bob Wilmoth, our director for our peanut
Yes,
program. Shout out to Bob. He totally would do that. He would be like,
he's that tough.
I'm here. I'm not rescheduling this thing. You
Yeah,
need to hear what I have to say.
exactly. Nothing's gonna slow me down. So anyway, he finally agreed to go to the hospital after the speech, and he carried that bullet around in his chest for the rest of his life because they decided it couldn't be safely removed. It was lodged too deep.
Maybe it was a good luck charm.
Yeah. So during his presidency, his political career, we'll say that, he was known as the trust buster. He broke up massive corporate monopolies. He made some very powerful enemies. Wall Street basically saw him as a traitor to his own class. He was a wealthy New York aristocrat, but at the same time attacking big businesses. JP Morgan and other industrial titans were pretty furious when he was going after their monopolies. They called him a socialist and claimed that he was going to destroy capitalism in America, but he didn't care. He just did what he thought he needed to do and kept doing it.
We all need to be more that way.
Yeah. The other cool legacy that he left behind that most people kind of probably think of him more for is his conservation efforts. They're pretty revolutionary at that time, but also super controversial. He created the United States Forest Service. He established the first 5 national parks. And it was controversial because a lot of people accused him of land grabbing and killing economic development. You know, he's trying to explain to lumber barons why they couldn't just cut down every tree in sight. But he just powered through all this criticism, which made him kind of a memorable and charismatic president.
That's amazing that he did all of those things. Can you imagine what the country would have been like if there was no land conservation at all?
Right. No Forest Service, no national parks. Those things seem so much a part of our modern day culture. It's hard to imagine that it would be controversial back then. Picture this, it's 1912. Remember, his presidency ended in 1909, but he had set up his buddy Taft to kind of be his predecessor. And once Taft got into office, things were not going the way Roosevelt had hoped they would. He was kind of reversing a lot of Roosevelt's progressive policies, especially around conservation and corporate regulation. And Roosevelt wasn't having it. So he decided to go again for the presidency for a 3rd term. And that's kind of where he was at this point in time. The election itself was pretty wild. After he got shot during this campaign speech, ultimately, Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, ended up winning the election. So Roosevelt lost, Taft lost. Roosevelt did come in second, though, beating Taft, which is the only time in U.S. history that a third-party candidate has ever done better than a major party nominee. The fact that he came in second and Taft came in third never happened before or since.
He's just a likable guy.
So when he lost this 3rd bid, he was frustrated. He was struggling with some depression, and he decided to take an invitation to go on a speaking tour in South America as his next big move. So Roosevelt headed down to Brazil, and he brought along his son, Kermit, who was going to join him for the speaking tour. Kermit was an experienced explorer himself, just like his father. And he was also a pretty fascinating character. He was really smart, adventurous. He also struggled with depression, which is something that can be hereditary. And it was something that would plague him, Kermit, throughout his life. He'd already been on several major expeditions, including one to East Africa with his father in 1909, and Kermit was fluent in Portuguese, which proved to be invaluable during this trip to South America and primarily Brazil that they embarked on.
So I have 2 questions for you. Number 1, did Kermit the Frog get named after Kermit? And number 2, how old was Kermit during this time?
Great question, and that is exactly what I wondered. So I'll have to get back to you on the relationship between Kermit Roosevelt and Kermit the Frog, because there may or may not be one. And to answer your question of how old was he was about 25. He was in his mid-20s at this time. So pretty young. But, you know, this was over 100 years ago, so young is relative.
Right, at that point, he was probably considered middle-aged.
Yeah. Roosevelt had a big family, so Kermit wasn't an only child. He had two daughters, Alice and Ethel, and three other sons, Theodore Jr., Archibald, and Quentin. And then, of course, his wife, Edith. The whole crew, other than Kermit, was kind of waiting for father and son back home as they went off on this adventure. While they're down in South America, it was suggested to them, hey, why don't you explore this completely unmapped river in the middle of the Amazon rainforest? And Roosevelt, being Roosevelt, basically said, sure, sounds fun, count us in. But this wasn't just any river. This was a waterway that was very mysterious, so mysterious that locals called it the River of Doubt. And even the most experienced Brazilian explorers weren't sure where it went or what lay along its course. It was literally uncharted terrain.
And they were just in Brazil just for the heck of it. He was just in a depressed mood and thought, oh, I just need a little adventure to boost my spirits. Is that how he ended up in Brazil to begin with?
Well, actually, after his presidential defeat, he was invited by a museum in Buenos Aires to give a series of lectures in South America. And instead of just doing this speaking tour, he wanted to have some exploration on the trip. He had that in mind, but he was kind of planning some relatively simple adventures down maybe some well known rivers in Brazil. But when they reached Rio de Janeiro on this speaking tour, he met with Brazilian officials, including a guy named Candido Rondon, who was Brazil's most famous explorer at that time. So he's chatting with Rondon, who suggested something far more ambitious, exploring this river of doubt, Rio da Duvida. And Roosevelt just couldn't say no, despite warnings about the really extreme dangers and lack of experience with this type of exploration. He was pretty immediately interested.
He's so extreme. He's like, it's okay. We're just sightseeing. It's fine.
He doesn't do anything halfway. And when the opportunity came up, the speaking tour sort of went out the window, and now they're gearing up to head down this river.
Yeah, the speaking tour sounds much more boring. You mentioned that this expedition happened after Roosevelt's failed 1912 campaign. How much do you think that that political defeat influenced his decision to undertake such a dangerous journey, just kind of throwing caution completely to the wind?
Well, that's actually a fascinating psychological angle. Roosevelt was definitely at a low point after the election. Not only had he lost this presidency, but he also had split the Republican Party, which was kind of a big deal, and some viewed it as a betrayal. So it's possible that this expedition might have been his way of sort of proving he was still relevant or capable of great things. He had this history of turning to intense adventures and physical challenges during personal crises. For example, after his first wife died much earlier in 1884, he went to the Dakota Territory to become a rancher. And this pattern of seeking extreme adventures during emotional low points was pretty characteristic for him.
That's interesting. I guess it's better than drinking yourself to death.
Exactly right. It's a good coping mechanism, or at least not a horrible one. So the expedition was led by this Colonel Candido Rondon, who I mentioned, and this guy deserves his own podcast episode, honestly. He was a Brazilian military officer who had spent decades exploring Brazil's interior, stringing telegraph lines through the Amazon. And what he was known for was his policy of peaceful contact with indigenous peoples. His motto was, quote, die if necessary, but never kill, end quote. And that was pretty revolutionary thinking for 1914, when most explorers probably would shoot first and ask questions later. He really had a lot of respect and interest in relationships with the indigenous people that he encountered on his explorations.
Well, the other thing is that those people potentially are going to keep you alive when things are going sideways.
Yeah, which they did. Here's where I need to mention something kind of important. This expedition was incredibly poorly planned, like monumentally poorly planned. And that's kind of weird because Roosevelt was usually meticulous about planning. It's kind of out of character for him. But the team ended up bringing these really heavy wooden canoes that were totally wrong for the river rapids. They packed way too much stuff. including a library of books. And they also brought these fancy folding canvas boats that were completely inappropriate for the terrain that they were in. They ended up being as useful as a screen door on a submarine.
This Rondon, it seems like he should know better. Maybe Roosevelt just really trusted him and thought, oh gosh, he's done all of this exploration before. He probably knows what he needs to bring, you know?
Yeah, or he was kinda like, "Hey, when in Rome, I've never been down a unnamed Amazonian river, so I'm putting my faith in this guy." The expedition team was a real mixed bag. There were 2 American naturalists, George Cherry and Leo Miller, and they were there to collect specimens, plants, and different species of animals and critters that they encountered. There was Anthony Fiala, who was supposed to be in charge of the supplies, but was associated with a previous disastrous Arctic expedition. And then a team of Brazilian comrades, which were the porters, the canoe handlers, the men who really did the heavy lifting of the expedition.
Who hired the guy that messed up the Arctic expedition? They're like, well, at least it's warm here, so it should be okay.
I think Rondon was at the helm of this operation, but you got to think Roosevelt had a hand in it too, being as powerful and well known as he was. They started their journey in February 1914, and literally from day one, everything that could go wrong goes wrong. They pretty quickly realized that they would have to abandon most of their supplies because they just couldn't carry everything. And what they didn't realize about the river is it's basically one continuous series of rapids. And I'm talking class 4, class 5 rapids. So big water, the kind of stuff that professional river guides might look at and go, yeah, maybe not today. They bit off more than they could chew. And that became evident early on.
That's why it's the river of doubt.
There was a lot of doubt from the moment they pushed offshore.
Yeah, the locals were like, I doubt that you're going to make it down this thing alive because there are too many rapids. Yeah.
The challenges they faced were relentless. They initially just started losing canoes left and right. They were either smashing them on rocks or having to portage them around rapids. And when I say portage, I mean cutting paths through virgin rainforest with machetes, carrying everything overland, these heavy wooden canoes, and then finding a path to get back on the river. And they're doing this while dealing with these savage insects, tropical diseases, constant threat of starvation.
Sounds like a good way to spend a vacation.
I think they thought it was gonna be more of a vacation than it actually was. And one of the fear factors was created by the wildlife that they were encountering. There were massive caimans, which is basically a prehistoric looking alligator that would follow their canoes. They encountered electric eels that were powerful enough to knock a horse unconscious, let alone a human. Jaguars, Roosevelt described as the most impressive predators that he'd ever seen. But as I mentioned before, the real terrors that they encountered were the tiny things. These vicious, biting insects called piums, I might be mispronouncing that, or borachudos, 2 names for the same insect. And these insects would bite and leave bleeding wounds that would get infected pretty easily in the humid air.
That sounds terrible.
About a month into the expedition, Roosevelt got a leg injury. He was trying to help save some canoes that had gotten loose in the rapids, and he banged his leg against a rock. Normally, a cut on your leg isn't the end of the world. You can clean it out, bandage it up, and move on. But when you're in the middle of the Amazon and you've got these critters that are, feasting on you every opportunity that they get, this cut turned into a massive infection. The infection went systemic. He developed this raging fever and now has this open leg wound that just won't heal. The infection got bad enough that eventually it actually ate into the flesh. We're talking about flesh-eating bacteria, deep enough that he could see bone in his
Oh,
lower leg,
wow.
exposing his tibia.
And also, you're going to be really struggling to keep that thing dry. It's probably just constantly wet.
Yeah, no way to dry it. Imagining what they had for a first aid kit at that point. So the food situation was another source of desperation. They were definitely burning more calories than they could possibly take in. even when they did manage to find food, which was their plan. They brought some food, but they set out with this idea that they're just going to find food along the way.
I don't think any of us should have that approach.
No, I think they learned their lesson in a memorable way. Roosevelt lost 57 pounds during the expedition. He dropped from 220 pounds to 163 pounds. It's like a quarter of his body weight.
At least he had a little to spare, hopefully.
Yeah, it sounds like he did. They got so hungry that when they did catch something edible, they would eat every part of it, bones and organs. At one point, they even ate the leather from their own boots when things got really
Oh
bad.
my gosh, can you imagine being that hungry?
I can't. Wear the leather on your boots looks good.
Right. That's crazy.
That's some deep hunger.
Deep hunger. That could be a book. Like all these situations where people were the most famished that you could ever imagine being.
Oh, yeah. Read that book with a plate full of nachos.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've already discovered the flesh-eating bacteria, the near starvation rations, and here's where it gets really interesting. Next comes the murder. Yes, you heard me right. At one point on this journey, one of their comrades named Julio killed another member of the expedition named Peychon. And this evolved over some petty dispute about food. I guess, as they were all starving, Julio was sneaking food and everybody knew it. And Peychon called him on it and said, "What's up, Julio? We know you're taking more than your share." And Julio pulled out a rifle and shot and killed Peychon.
Did they eat Peychon?
They didn't, because immediately after this happened, Julio disappeared into the jungle, just took off running. And now the rest of the team is terrified about him potentially stalking them or sneaking in at night and stealing their food. They just didn't know what happened to the guy. And they actually never found him again. He was never seen again that anyone knows of.
I'm sure he died in the jungle. That was not a very good move.
He either died in the jungle or made it back to civilization somewhere else. But the prevailing thought is, taking off by yourself into the jungle where they were is basically the equivalent of suicide at that point.
Yeah, it's one of those things that you do when you're not in your right mind. When you are starving, I think that your frontal cortex is not exactly working appropriately.
Your survival brain is calling the shots at that point.
Yep. You mentioned that they were so hungry that they started consuming their boots at one point. What exactly were they eating during the expedition, and how did their food situation become so desperate? I mean, you did mention that they didn't really bring enough food to begin with.
Well, it was a product of this poor planning. The food situation kind of evolved from good intentions to reality. They'd started with canned goods and dried meat, but really early on had to abandon most of their supplies, including these food rations, because they just couldn't carry everything through the unanticipated portages. So they decided, we'll just hunt and fish, try and wrangle up as much food as we can from the jungle. But the jungle just really wasn't the abundant paradise of resources that they'd imagined. Many areas were actually quite empty of large game. So they occasionally caught fish or shot monkeys or birds, but it just wasn't enough for the calories that they were burning. And like I said, they would eat everything they could, bone marrow, organ meat. And when it came to the leather, they would boil the leather on their boots or in leather equipment to kind of make a soup. By the end of this expedition, they were looking at things like leaves and hoping that they might be edible. They were so desperate.
Well, there were probably a lot of edible things in the forest that they just didn't know were edible.
I'm sure there were, yeah, and that's where good relationships with the locals would have served him well. I think this area was so largely uninhabited, it sounded like they weren't encountering much in the way of other people.
They just should have brought a botanist from South America with them.
Shoulda, woulda, coulda, Roosevelt. At another point on this adventure, Roosevelt himself gets so sick that he tried to convince the group to leave him behind. So apparently he was carrying a lethal dose of morphine and was ready to end his own life rather than slow down the expedition and risk everyone else's survival, including his son.
That's crazy.
It made me want to ask you, Casey, when you go out adventuring, do you carry a lethal dose of morphine in your first aid kit, in your survival kit, just in case?
Usually, I mean, you just never know when you might need to end your life with drugs.
You never know.
Hopefully, he was bringing the lethal dose of morphine not to use it lethally, you know?
Right. Hopefully he was using it for pain management should they need it, which they did. Ultimately, Roosevelt's son, Kermit, and Colonel Rondon also refused to abandon him. They weren't having it. And Kermit, in particular, showed strong dedication to his dad, basically willing himself and his father through this whole ordeal through sheer determination. He became the wind beneath his wings.
This is less dire, but I think I told you before about how we were climbing the Great Northern, which I don't, have you ever climbed the Great Northern, Julie?
I haven't, no.
Oh, you have to come here and we'll do it. But it's kind of an arduous climb. And my brother got tendonitis. I've said this to you before, but he was like, just leave me at the summit. Like, just come back to the trailhead in a few hours for me. Just go on without me. We're like, you must be out of your mind. We're not just going to leave you on a mountain with an injury and get back a few hours later for you. What are you thinking?
That's not happening. That's because you're a good sister. So when they finally reach civilization after all of these trials and tribulations, including losing several men and nearly dying multiple times, Roosevelt became a changed man. The expedition had taken a massive toll on his health. That leg infection really never healed properly. And he contracted malaria throughout this, which would recur for the rest of his life, as malaria can when it's not adequately treated. And to add insult to injury, he also ended up with this parasitic infection called filariasis, which causes ongoing health problems and did for him. Is this something you've ever dealt with, Casey? Filariasis?
I know I've heard of that before.
Well, it's an endemic parasitic disease to latitudes similar to Brazil, and it's caused by a microscopic thread-like worm called the filarial worm. This worm is transmitted through mosquito bites, where infected mosquitoes just transfer these little worm larvae into humans when they bite.
Oh, that's crazy.
And it's tenacious. Once you got it, at least in 1914, there's not a lot you can do to get rid of it. Nowadays, we treat it with ivermectin or one of the azoles, but even then, it's a tough one to get rid of.
So, Julie, tell us about how this whole adventure concluded. Did they discover what they set out to discover? Did they make it to the end of the river?
They did make it. Believe it or not, they not only concluded the expedition as they intended to, minus a few team members that they lost along the way, and they made some pretty significant scientific discoveries. They discovered several new species of birds, including a new type of a river cardinal. They also documented a previously unknown river dolphin species, which is pretty interesting. They collected over 2,000 bird specimens and about 500 mammal specimens. How they were transporting all these specimens, I'm not sure. But perhaps more importantly, they provided accurate mapping of this river, which turns out was a major tributary to the Amazon. And that was a huge contribution to South American geography.
All of which you just have mentioned seems completely unbelievable. It's almost like they went to Mars or something. I mean, I know that sounds dramatic, but the fact that they actually collected anything of significant value or actually mapped this river is unbelievable. Because you know, when you hit a bump in the road and you're just finally like, we're throwing it all out the window, we just have to survive.
We are focused on one thing alone, survival, which they were. I mean, we got people murdering other people, open flesh-eating bacteria, exposed bone, malaria.
But it's like, who is looking to catalog new species of birds while you're literally eating shoe leather for dinner? I mean, that is unbelievable.
It's true. Yeah, how did those 500 mammals not get eaten? You can still see these specimens at the American Museum of Natural History. They're still being studied today, and researchers continue to make new discoveries based on their collections.
So, Julie, tell me, what did Roosevelt do with his time after he returned from this amazing adventure, if you want to call it that? Did he get back into politics?
Well, the years following this expedition were actually pretty tough for him. He returned to find America on the brink of entering World War I, which he strongly supported. And all four of his sons served in that war, including his youngest son, Quentin, who died in 1918 in World War I. And that death hit him particularly hard. This was only maybe 4 years later. Roosevelt's health continued to decline. Some of the health problems he had were directly related to the tropical diseases he'd encountered on the River of Doubt.
Well, also, like being in the United States, the medical providers are not going to have the knowledge of what type of diseases probably are happening in South America. And I'm sure didn't have the means to treat them at that point in time.
Yeah, who knows if Roosevelt himself even knew what was going on with his health. He ended up dying in his sleep on January 6, 1919, at his home in Oyster Bay, New York. So that was only 5 years after this expedition. He was young, age 60. And doctors had said that the lingering effects of the river expedition had likely shortened his life by at least several years.
I'm surprised he didn't die on that river expedition with that injury that you were talking about, with his bone being exposed. Most people wouldn't have made it very many days after that degree of infection.
Roosevelt wrote a book recounting all of these unbelievable details. And when he finally made it back to New York after this, many people initially didn't believe his stories about the expedition, as you can kind of understand. Some newspapers even suggested that he faked the whole thing or that he was greatly exaggerating these dangers. But it wasn't until the geographical societies verified their findings and other expedition members corroborated his stories, the skeptics were silenced. The Brazilian surveys that were conducted after his death in the 1920s really confirmed everything that Roosevelt had claimed. His book was called Through the Brazilian Wilderness, and it portrayed a really completely changed Roosevelt. His character was very different in the book in comparison to what people knew as this political figure. This was a man who'd really built his reputation on being kind of uber masculine, never show weakness type of character. But he was surprisingly vulnerable after this expedition. He wrote about his fears, his weaknesses, how close he came to giving up. It was like the experience kind of stripped away all this bravado and left a raw human underneath.
That's really interesting. There was like an altercation with his ego.
Yeah, his ego probably took a hit, got knocked down a few levels. As for Kermit, his son, his story after the expedition is fascinating but also tragic. He served with distinction in both world wars, but struggled with alcoholism and depression. And ultimately, he would take his own life while serving in Alaska during World War II. And it's thought that his time on the River of Doubt really marked him pretty deeply, just as it had his father.
I just hope all those plant species were worth it.
Well, another outcome of this adventure is it's no longer called the River of Doubt. It's now called the Roosevelt River in Brazil, or Rio Roosevelt. So they named the river after him, 400 miles long. And as I mentioned, the expedition and their studies proved that it does eventually flow into the Arapuana River, which feeds into the Madeira River and ultimately into the Amazon. So they'd actually discovered one of the principal southern tributaries of the Amazon River, as I said, a major geographical achievement. Colonel Rondon went on to have a pretty amazing career in Brazil. He continued to work with indigenous peoples and eventually became a marshal in the Brazilian army. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957 for his humanitarian work with the Amazon tribes. And they've actually named a Brazilian state, Rondônia, after him.
He must have been one of those people. He had been exposed to all the parasites for so long that his body just didn't respond anymore to them.
Yeah, he was invincible by that point. So this wild expedition kind of stands as a perfect example of both the best and worst of human nature. You've got this incredible bravery, scientific curiosity that drove these men to explore the unknown. But the other side with hubris, basically that led them to undertake such a dangerous journey without prior preparation. They didn't bring all 7 Ps. They only brought 1 or 2. Prior proper
Mhm.
planning preventing piss poor performance.
Yeah, they actually didn't end up with piss poor performance miraculously.
Well, except for the murder part.
They just had a couple bad eggs on their trip, that was all.
Couple bad eggs, at least 1. Roosevelt himself probably summed it up best when he wrote, "It's not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the person who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood."
I like that. That seems so relevant even to today, especially with the online world where people like to tear other people down. And it's like,
Yeah,
what really matters is who's out there doing it. Because the people that are out there doing it are not judging the other people that are out there doing it. It's all the people on the sidelines that don't really know how hard it is.
yeah. Who's out there doing it?
Get in the ring with the bull.
Right, the critics. It's one thing to criticize, it's another thing to buck up and get it done. Roosevelt got in the ring on the River of Doubt, and somehow, against all odds, he lived to tell the tale. It cemented his legacy as one of history's most remarkable figures, a man who, even in his mid-50s, was willing to risk everything in the pursuit of adventure and scientific discovery.
He's one of those historical figures that would be probably really entertaining to have a conversation with.
Yeah, if you could pick anyone to have dinner with,
Yeah.
alive or dead, he might be near the top of the list.
Yeah. Who else would be on your list?
Um, Bob Marley, we share a birthday. How about you?
I would say either Albert Einstein or Benjamin Franklin,
Oh, okay.
like creative thinkers. I mean, you might as well pick someone who's impressive.
Yeah. All right. That is a story of Theodore Roosevelt and the River of Doubt. Probably the most intense bad day in presidential history. So next time you're having a rough day, just remember at least you're not trying to navigate an unmapped river in the Amazon while fighting off flesh-eating bacteria and parasitic worms.
And especially because the river was called the River of Doubt, which just is so warm and fuzzy.
Aptly named. Before we wrap up, we'd like to ask you for your support in spreading the word about the Crux True Survival Stories. If you enjoyed our episode today, please take a moment, visit our Instagram page at the Crux Podcast, share our latest posts on your stories, and help us reach more fellow survival enthusiasts. If you haven't already, please consider leaving a rating and a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your contribution allows us to continue bringing you compelling stories of survival. Reach out. We'd love to hear from you. Our email address is thecruxsurvival@gmail.com. Share your survival stories with us. Thank you for your support and have a great week.
Yeah, have a great week, everybody.